What's up, bangers? Welcome back to the Banger Hangar for the brand new version of your favorite show from BangerTV. This is Lock Horns Redux, not live, but in some comfy chairs, sitting down and discussing, debating, and locking horns around all things metal. Hey everybody, I'm Sam Dunn. Welcome back to Lock Horns Redux, BangerTV's all-metal show. This week I'm pretty excited. We get to tackle a big topic in metal this year. Why? Well, because it's 2020, and arguably 50 years ago this year, the year 1970, is when this thing called heavy metal was birthed. And so this week, we're going to dig into what is the most important slash best slash maybe even most influential metal year of all time. So by the end of the conversation, we want to all try and reach some kind of agreement as to what that year is. And there are no better qualified historians, eggheads, I use that in the most endearing way possible, about all things metal than Martin Popoff and John Semley. Hello. Welcome, guys. Glad you could join us for this.
Thanks for having us.
Are we excited? Are we scared?
Absolutely. I think we're ready.
I think we'll arrive. This is what this is all about, is consensus. Lock Horns is famous for that, right? Well, uncontroversial conclusions.
This is going to be tough because, you know, as we usually say at the outset of every Lock Horns Redux is, you know, metalheads like opinions. We have a lot of them, and it's often hard for us to agree on the bands, the albums, the years, the songs, the producers, the artwork, the blah, 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 that matters most. But Martin, how you been?
Well, still just a lot of book stuff.
Yeah.
New Iron Maiden book called Holy Smoke, Iron Maiden in the 90s. I'm going to do a 2000s one. I had an 80s one come out last year, new Merciful Fate book. Cool. And a book out through Penguin, because Goldmine bought out Penguin, called 10 Albums That Changed My Life, where we just kind of interviewed a lot of people and got that answer. And a podcast, new podcast called History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff.
Amazing. No more prolific metal man than Martin Popoff. John, how are you? What have you been up to?
Yeah, no, good. Working on projects here and elsewhere and traveling a bit.
Yeah.
And frankly, the bulk of my spare time in the past 2 weeks have been preparing to pretend to be as knowledgeable as Martin Popoff about all these dates and figures and stuff.
We all get up in the morning wishing we may compete with Martin
well, I hope
one
I don't
day.
Disappoint you.
Okay, so we're going to give you the throne here, Martin. So just a general barometer. I mean, you know, a lot of people say 1970 is the year that metal began. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think this is perfect to do this now, 50 years. You know, there was a lot of hard rock, psych rock, all sorts of things coming up, MC5, Stooges, Blue Cheer, Cream, Jimi Hendrix. But 1970, February 13th, Friday, it was a Friday, the 13th, Black Sabbath's first album, Black Sabbath, comes out. Black Sabbath has another album in 1970, later on, with Paranoid. Deep Purple in rock, you know, they were just kind of a psyche band before, but this album is like wall-to-wall heavy, except for one mellow song.
Right.
Uriah Heep, very heavy, very humble, with Gypsy and Bird of Prey. So there's a lot of super heavy stuff that sounds nothing like anything before coming out right at this time. It's doomy, it's not particularly based on the blues. There's some grinding keyboards in there, there's wailing guitar solos, it's a little bit based on classical with Ritchie Blackmore. So yeah, 1970, big difference from anything, you know, loud and guitar-y and distorted.
I mean, the episode might be over now. I don't know. Maybe Martin did it. I mean, you're gonna
I'm not even gonna
tango with the master here. Any thoughts
I think like metaphorically, like that thunder crash at the beginning of Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath, like it is a very useful place to say this is where heavy metal began. That first album, it's still a little bit kind of bluesy and bar bandy in places, and but yeah, certainly. But is the first year the most influential year or the most important year?
I don't know.
I
think that's what we got to figure out. You know, and obviously 1970 and around that time is very important. But you know, yeah, if we are talking about the most important metal year, most influential, best, whatever. I mean, there's a few other highlights. 1970, we've kind of talked about. Black Sabbath and Deep Purple released the first metal or proto-metal albums, which is something I kind of want to get into. Which is it? 1986, maybe another obvious choice. 3 of the big 4 of thrash release arguably the genre's 3 greatest thrash albums. 1989, the Recording Academy recognizes heavy metal artists for the first time, although we all know what happened. Yeah.
And the winner is Crest of a Knave, Jethro Tull.
You know, there could possibly not have been a worse beginning to metal's moment in the Academy. 1994, second wave of black metal emerges primarily in Norway, where we have Emperor, Enslaved, Marduk, Mayhem, and many others. But okay, so that's just a snapshot. Between 1970 and 2019, just to get the waters simmering here. Are there any other milestone moments in metal between 70 and 2019 that sort of pop to mind as being significant?
For me, and with this stuff, it's always a matter of taste in a certain respect, but
yeah.
I think the early 90s were such a huge period. I mean, you have this thing where a lot of the hair metal bands were essentially disbanding. Thrash itself was arguably in a bit of a fallow period, except for the explosiveness of the Black Album in 91 and Countdown to Extinction in 92, which I would argue is a better mainstream thrash album than the Black Album.
Shocker! Anyway.
But yeah, I mean, I think you had so much stuff happening, as you mentioned, with second wave black metal, which I think you could date back to 92. You had those sort of desert scene bands like Sleep and Caius coming out.
Right.
You had industrial metal, Ministry and Fear Factory starting, Ministry putting out major albums.
Yep.
And like just fun bands like White Zombie, La Sexorcisto, and that stuff. I mean, that to me is a period where alt-rock and metal were kind of commingling in a way that was very productive, and you had a lot of fun albums, both in the kind of Lollapalooza mainstream at the time and in the underground. If you're a death metal person, there's probably no finer time than the first 3 years of the 1990s.
Well, let me pick that up, and I want to hear your thoughts, Martin. I mean, yes, taste is a factor here. I mean, I don't know what the year is exactly, but certainly the emergence of the Florida death metal scene is very important, especially shot through the lens of where we are now, where death metal is like the dominant underground metal genre. Who would have thought, you know, decades ago that would be the case? And of course, piggybacking sort of around there, we've got Stockholm and Gothenburg coming up with that sound as well, which, you know, again,
at the gates,
taste.
92, first record.
Those were big moments, certainly for me as a fan. But Martin, what else comes to mind for you?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned milestones, and I like the way, John, you took it to certain genres and stuff. So, I mean, to stay on that tack, I would say a moment is the new wave of British heavy metal.
Right.
I think that's a big moment because that's where you get an identity for metal, a pride in metal. The album covers are metal. The bands are singing about metal. I think that's when something happens. Now, I just said metal, and I think I mean heavy metal at that point, because there's another milestone, which is more of a metal milestone, and that's kind of the rise of thrash, I think, and with Kill 'Em All in '83. So, you know, when you talk about death metal and black metal, I think if you go back to a moment that kind of spawns all of that, it has to be that thrash moment.
Right.
Now, other milestones, I know reading some of the comments on this, I mean, people talk about milestones. There's happy ones and sad ones are deaths of certain people. Those are milestones as well. But another big milestone, I think, has to be MTV. It's not a metal milestone per se, but MTV is actually pretty metal friendly right from the start, and I think it causes a big thing that's going to link to a year that I want to talk about later. I think it really helps in terms of being super influential because it causes, I would say, from '83 to about 1991, the golden period commercially for heavy metal.
For sure. Lots of good points in there, and it's noteworthy nobody mentioned the emergence of a band from Jacksonville, Florida called Limp Bizkit.
Oh, we can get there.
But anyway, I don't want to fan those flames this early because someone will surely get burnt. But I know we've talked a lot about the Nawabum thing way back with Headbanger's Journey and with Metal Evolution, and I think we always put our flag in the sand, and maybe we'll pick this up later, that metal as a definable genre and culture and something that people identified with actually did not start happening until the early 80s in the UK. And so that's why we often use the word proto-metal to refer to the Sabbath, the Purples, the Led Zeppelins, etc., and a lot of those albums from the 70s. So I kind of throw out on the table, are we even talking about the 70s at all if we indeed are sort of defining the birth of heavy metal as a genre and as a culture in the 80s? But we'll pick that up because I know that's potentially a hornet's nest. We do want to talk to people that have commented on this, lots of opinions coming in, and I think to give this conversation some kind of parameter, rather than start with the year, we're going to start with the decades to just kind of get into the conversation and start to whittle down to the year. Okay, so first up we've got Jamie Laszlo. Welcome back, Jamie. He says the 70s has to be the most influential. Without that decade, you wouldn't have the iconic albums that came out in the 80s. You made a joke earlier. You don't have the 80s without the 70s. Haha. He's right, I guess, in a way. Fabio BM said, I'd argue that the 70s is the most influential, not only because of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, although we could argue the most important Priest records happened in the 80s, but I know you got opinions about that, and probably you too. But also because all the great prog bands who still today influence many metal bands. Interesting point given how big prog metal is right now. Roy Arobasho says, while it was the 70s where metal was forged, it was the 80s where it got its cutting edge. Haha, always love a blacksmith metaphor on Lock Horns. Peter Vanderwall says, which decade is most influential? Definitely the 80s. In the 70s, you could count the metal bands that become big names on one hand. Metal exploded in popularity in the 80s, bigger audiences, more styles, more classic records. Max Morin. The 90s were the most influential. That's when metal went back underground and all the subgenres really flourished. That's a good point. That's when we really have the proliferation of subgenres in metal, that real diversification and expands globally, which is another thing worth considering. Manon Adedia says 90s were the most influential because there was a major expansion in the sound of metal, groove metal, black metal, new metal, mellow death, tech death, prog metal, etc. As someone else put it, 90s were a time to let your freak flag fly. The diversity in the sound of metal we see today can be traced to the expansion we went through then. Good point. Brendan Goggin, the 90s get a lot of crap for being a bad decade, but honestly, it might be the most influential in terms of forming more extreme fringe genres that we know, that we now love today. And lastly, Richard Hewitt, this discussion reveals a strong bias to when we first fell in love with metal. Okay, there's a lot there, John.
Yeah.
What do you want to pick up on?
The conversation about the 70s, I mean, first of all, this proto-metal thing, like when I think proto-metal, I think Black Widow, Sir Lord Baltimore, you know, Black Sabbath to me is uncontroversially a heavy metal band or a metal band. I mean, to call them proto-metal doesn't really make sense to me. I mean, I think you get to, you know, even a band like Thin Lizzy, which had such an influence on that sort of Iron Maiden guitar sound, had key albums. But it's like, whoever said that you could count the bands on one hand, I mean, I think that's accurate. I think until you get to 1979 or 1980, 1980 arguably, I mean, that's, you're no longer in the 70s, but that's when you have, you know, British Steel and the first Maiden album and Venom forms, and Saxon puts out 2 records that year, I think. So that Nwabum sound was really kind of coalescing. You know, you might want to say that's when it kind of became a thing. So I think the 80s, obviously, it depends on the taste, depends what you like, are a huge period for metal. Again, I agree with the 90s, not only with the underground stuff, but with kind of a mainstreaming happening simultaneously. I mean, the influence of the Black Album in turning heavy metal into a kind of big tent, you can't underestimate. A lot of people hate the late 90s, and, you know, whatever you say about Korn reinventing the genre, granted, no one had really put out an album like that before, but there might have been a sort of deleterious trickle down from there.
Martin, now you spent some time talking about the 70s and 80s, and I know you're immersed in that world, both as a fan and as an expert. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts more on the 90s and the thousands. Like, what's going on there in your mind that's important for metal?
Yeah, I think the big thing that happens is, okay, first of all, there's that, you know, apocryphal death of hair metal with grunge happening. So at that point, you know, the commercial prospects for all forms of heavy metal go down, and it almost causes bands to be stronger in what they do.
The 90s is typically seen as a bad time for heavy metal. From your perspective, what were the 90s like for Maiden and for heavy metal in general?
It was a tough time originally because everyone was thinking that, you know, that metal was going to be dead and all this. You know, I even remember in Germany, and I remember, you know, taking the mick out of them at the time, because Metal Hammer took the metal off the Metal Hammer. It was just hammer, and I was like, what are you doing? You know, you of little faith, you know. It was just laughable, really, but, you know, people got that worried. They thought metal was going to completely die and all this, and I'm like, well, okay, it might lose a bit of popularity, but it's not going to completely die, you know, and we were the proof for that, because we were still going out and playing, like, big places and a lot of people, but the good thing about it was a challenge. There's no two ways about that. We carried on. And the fans were so hardcore. They all wanted it not only to survive but to do well, and also it was just this more elements of like us against the world more than ever. So, in actual fact, it was quite a challenging time, but it was actually very gratifying as well, because sometimes when you have to fight a little bit harder for what you want, it's actually more enjoyable. And it was fantastic.
And as you mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of subgenres happening. So death metal is progressing. Pantera is really the band that runs the 90s. I mean, I think every album is platinum. They're very heavy. They're like Metallica on steroids, essentially. But they're thrashy, they're groove, they're, you know, as we talked about on Metal Evolution, they even have a little bit of influence on the new metal thing coming up.
And just to jump in, let's not forget, the Black Album, arguably the most impactful hard record ever made, actually comes out in the 90s.
Yeah, but it's funny you mention that, because there's another album that looks exactly like the Black Album that did exactly the same thing in the 80s, and that was AC/DC, Back in Black. I mean, that thing went diamond, right?
Yeah. I also want to say, too, with the 90s, and not to be that person who makes every music conversation about this, but the success of Nevermind made it the idea of playing loud music. I'm not going to call Nirvana a metal band, but playing loud guitar music that could be kind of introspective and a little bit weird, it made it the biggest thing on planet Earth. So like that's when you see a lot of bands, like even if you like Helmet and bands like that, could they have thrived without the success of Nirvana? I mean, everyone's kind of signing to major labels at that time.
Smashing Pumpkins is totally heavy. Soundgarden's totally heavy. You get Alice in Chains coming up. So you get a new creativity coming in, and then heavy metal is like just being bombarded by negativity all the time, and so there's all these little, you know, as you mentioned, you get the industrial metal. Machine Head starts coming in, so there's some reinventing that goes on that leads eventually to your Lamb of Gods and stuff like that.
Well, I want to talk about that, because I think, you know, the master narrative in metal for the longest time was, and we're going to get to the topic of the fallow years, the bad moments in metal over the decades. But, you know, the 90s was always characterized as a fallow decade, as the decade where everyone cut their hair and lead singers left major bands and bands changed their sound and blah, blah, blah. But what I find interesting is that as time has passed, and this is kind of how telling history works, is that 90s was actually one of the most productive times, and one of the viewers made this point in terms of the proliferation of the underground scene particularly. And you know, now in 2020, I mean, some of my favorite metal albums actually came out in the 90s. So I don't know, it's just funny how that works.
Well, I think like 1990 itself, I mean, you have Cannibal Corpse, first album, Spiritual Healing by Death, I think came out in 1990 or 1992.
Around there, 91,
and people say 94 for the second wave of black metal. I mean, the first Burzum album was 92, the first Emperor EP was 92, the first Norwegian church burning was in 1992. And yeah, I think there was a lot going on there before things, like maybe I would agree with the late 90s being a bit of a fallow period, but the other thing that I think of a lot is the collapse of punk and hardcore. Like the standard logic there is like there was no good hardcore after 84, so you have people like Danzig or Henry Rollins essentially starting metal bands, you know? And I think, there was a lot of creative stuff that happened. I can see where the back half of the decade might get a bad rap. But those first 4 or 5 years, I brook no complaint. In fact, I love them.
Well, it's technology too, right? I mean, it just got much cheaper and easier to make albums, and then really the 2000s is even more productive.
And albums sounded better. Like a Fear Factory album compared to like an 80s metal album, like the recording is incredible.
You know, I like to get into the weeds on production and the way the music sounded, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact, let's be honest, like a lot of the heavier metal records made in the 80s just did not sound very good. I mean, that first generation of thrash metal albums, you know, and certainly the very first generation of, you know, bands like Morbid Angel and Death and Obituary coming out of Florida and others. I mean, it took a while for the technology and the production, particularly in the drums, but in other areas as well, to kind of catch up with the speed and the intensity of the playing. It just sounded mushy until the 90s.
Well, I have a question for you about this, because I think you talked about this in the Extreme Metal Metal Evolution episode about hearing At the Gates for the first time, and like being in a place where it's like there's nothing interesting going on, and then you heard At the Gates. Like, was that a common thing at the time, that this sort of melodic sound was just totally new?
I mean, At the Gates clearly didn't come out of nowhere. No one ever does. I mean, you had In Flames and you had sort of different sort of percolations of a different kind of sound. I think it was the combination. For me, personally, it was the combination. It felt like the first extreme metal band that really listened to and studied a lot of Iron Maiden. So it was like the perfect. It was the perfect match for me. And of course, it had a certain production value that it stood the test of time. I mean, it was a ridiculously simple sounding record in terms of how the guitars were captured and stuff like that. But you know, as we've talked about before, that record in particular is bigger now than when it came out in the mid '90s. I mean, the band broke up shortly after. I mean, it had a much bigger impact 20 years later than what it did at the time, which is just funny how music works sometimes. But then something unexpected started to happen. The word about this album began to spread.
It was really just a record that was passed around by kids and just sort of built that reputation, that influence, I think, just on the strength of how good it was. You know, at the time, like, you know, people recognize it as a great record, but no one ever thought that it would have sort of the life and the influence that it's proven to have.
You know, here's a band, Sweden, never really sold a lot of records, you know, did pretty well, but for some reason, all of these bands connected on a musical level with that band and what they were doing at that time.
When I first started hearing At the Gates, it gave me hope that, oh God, there are some guys that are still flying the flag, and all right, we have a chance at some good music.
Slaughter of the Soul was probably like what changed a lot of, honestly, the Boston metal hardcore scene. It's funny because it wasn't a huge record that like sold tons and this and that, but everybody knew about it, like, and everyone was talking about it. I feel my soul.
Clearly, Slaughter of the Soul had become a much bigger record over the passage of time, and it influenced a new generation of metal bands and even spawned new metal subgenres. Okay, so we kind of got into what we thought was the bad moments in metal and then came back to the positive in metal. I don't know how that happened, but I did want to go back to some of the viewers who have sent in their opinions on what are some of the less memorable moments in metal history. We've got Jeff Sornig, who says the 1990s into the early 2000s sucked. So maybe this is corroborating your late 90s idea. Grunge and alternative radio took over. Bands like Slayer, Exodus, and Overkill stayed the course, but those were challenging years for metal, although Slayer put out a funny little new metal-y album in there somewhere. Thank God for bands like Pantera, Sepultura, and Lamb of God, who helped keep the metal flame alive during the dark days. Marcus Ferguson says a lot of blame was put on grunge to have killed 80s metal, but it was out of control. Grunge was the bullet in the head that era of music desperately needed. It took a while, but metal came back stronger, smarter, meaner. Peter Vanderwell is another thought. Which year was the worst for metal? 2010. Because that's the year we lost our greatest vocalist, Ronnie James Dio. There are no bad years when it comes to album releases. In my opinion, metal has never bored me. J.R. Schartzer comments, I don't think that any decade was necessarily more embarrassing than any other. Every decade has innovated and built on what came before in creative, artful ways. Genres tell us a lot about where our culture was. Hair metal tells us where the world was in the 80s, as grunge tells us where the headspace was in the early 90s. I imagine that to an anthropologist, that makes it all of it valid. Azael Garza, worst year, 2000. Although metal had experienced some new influences with the peak of nu metal, some of the common characteristics that had previously defined metal had all but erased in the mainstream, with slower tempos of nu metal, its preference for rhythmic instrumental groove over instrumental proficiency, and some of the larger heavy acts like Limp Bizkit preferring a more hip-hop oriented vocal and lyrical style. This combined with the experimentation of seminal acts in the 90s like Metallica's Loads and Slayer's Diabolus and In Musica put metal further away than ever from inspiring the next generation for the passion and dedication that heavy metal music fans are known for. Azael. Nice work. Send in the PhD so we can all study and learn something about metal. Okay, we got to make some decisions, put some flags in the sand so we can move on to the best years or most important years in metal. So Martin, best decade, most important decade, most influential decade in metal?
I think it's got to be the 80s, because I think most of what happens in the 90s and the 2000s, most of that music in rough form is invented in the 80s. You know, the 70s, I agree with you, John, like there's Black Sabbath's a metal band, but again, you can count the number of metal bands on one hand. The imagery isn't there. It's a little hard rocky. A lot of people will call most of that stuff proto-metal. But 1980, you get a very important thing happening with the new wave of British heavy metal. When we get into the years, I'll talk a little more about that, because I'm thinking maybe 1980 might be my year. But I'm also thinking 1983 might be my year. But again, there's arguments for 86. There's arguments for 88. There's a lot of big stuff that happens. Death metal's invented. Thrash is invented. Hair metal is there. And, you know, above all, again, something I alluded to earlier, I mean, this is the period with multi-platinum heavy metal albums everywhere you look. So it's a great time to be a metal band. And it's a great time for all these guys to, you know, to get some money out of this thing that they loved in the 70s, listening to all these bands that were basically unthanked, like Judas Priest was nobody in the 70s. So there's a ton of 70s bands that do great in the 80s. A bunch of genres come up. Even grunge is invented in the 80s. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. And basically, I would say the 80s has got to be the answer.
Popoff in for the 80s. Semley?
Again, if I was on a desert island with a metal year, it'd be like 92. Souls at Zero by Neurosis, Pure by Godflesh, Angel Dust by Faith No More, Countdown to Extinction. For me, it's like so many of my favorite records, but that's an appeal to emotion, right? That's all about me, and I'm just one guy. I'm just some fucking
But
idiot.
this is about you, John Semley.
No, but I mean, I agree.
You're on the couch, man.
That's true. The casting couch.
Sorry, carry on.
But I do think that you have to, if you're looking at it with any measure of objectivity, say that the 80s were arguably the most important decade, maybe the most fertile decade, certainly the time when metal became an American and not just a British, and maybe even a global concern. And I think that's really important. I mean, you can go back to the 60s and, you know, everyone likes to say that Pentagram or whomever, like they were actually the first metal band, you know. But I think that America's real influence on metal started with thrash. I mean, I don't think that's it was all the people who were listening to Wabam.
All right. So we're not going to do any locking of horns on the decades.
We can lock horns on years.
We can lock horns on years for sure, because, I mean, you know, I could be a contrarian just for funsies and pick another decade, but I would agree about the 80s being the most important decade in metal. And maybe just one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is I think what's interesting about the 70s, or what my sense of it is, yes, you have these very innovative, pioneering, heavy records that come out at the early part of the decade. This is something I've always kind of struggled with. And yet there doesn't seem to be any concerted sort of picking up of the baton that happens.
True,
like, yes, there's a lot of really important, heavy albums that are made in the 1970s, from Kiss to Aerosmith and so many others, but there's no slipstream behind Sabbath and Zeppelin and Purple that goes, we're going to take in rock and we're going to do this. It just seems to kind of fade away, and then something happens right around the end of the 70s when, you know, we've got the formation of Maiden, we've got Motorhead, who really hasn't been brought up in the conversation so far, we've obviously got Judas Priest, all these bands that form in the 70s, clearly because they're influenced by those early albums, but they really don't hit their stride, interestingly, until the 80s. So you've actually got bands that formed in the 70s making their most important albums in the 80s, and then immediately after, seminal records like British Steel and, you know, I mean, where do you go from there? You've got, you know, Number of the Beast and on. You've got thrash that comes up. You've got a whole generation of music coming out of both of America and the UK that really picks up the baton. And I've said it before, I say it again, I won't say it ever again, is that you have the birth of heavy metal culture. And so it's hard for me to put my flag anywhere else.
I also think 1980 specifically, like you have the Heaven and Hell record with Dio joining Sabbath. You have Ozzy's first solo record.
Yeah.
You have those bands like Witchfinder General coming out who are really doing the sort of Sabbath thing. Maybe a little late, but for a lot of people, like those are good records because they essentially sound like leftover Sabbath records or something like that. And yeah, you know, bands like Accept and AC/DC. British Steel came out in 1980, I'm pretty sure. And again, whatever you make of them, I think that like Venom founding, like Venom was such a huge band on the future of metal. You want to talk about a band who didn't care about sounding good, who didn't care about any of that shit except for being evil and being cool. You know, I mean, I think they changed so much.
And Martin, you mentioned earlier, let's not underestimate the power of the music video. Is like a whole new element entered the music industry, which gave a whole new platform, and actually metal really benefited from music videos. And a more nerdy side note, I suppose, is you got the further professionalization of the music industry. People kind of forget that in the 60s, like the music industry and record labels were still kind of like trying to figure it out. It's until the 70s that you really start to get like the idea of the Bill Grahams of the world really cashing in and turning it into big business. And then you get into the 80s and then you've got all the majors and you've got all these independent albums.
Package tours.
Independent labels that come out in its wake. I mean, you've got from Earache to Combat to Metal Blade. I mean, we could spend a whole episode just talking about that. Take me back to the LA metal scene right around the late 70s, early 80s when you were just kind of getting into the music.
There wasn't a lot of metal here, but there was, like in the late 70s, club-wise, you had Quiet Riot would play. This band, it was one of my big favorites, was called Exciter, X-C-I-T-E-R, which was George Lynch, who ended up in Dawkins' band. But there was a little bit of a metal scene happening around there. There was also a very big kind of new wave scene then, too, with Bungo Boingo and Wall of Voodoo and these sort of bands, and also a punk scene with X and there was X and the Germs and the Dead Kennedys. Even though they were from Frisco, they would come down a lot. So there was kind of a lot of stuff happening in the late 70s, and the metal thing was just kind of beginning. I mean, really, at that point, Quiet Riot was probably the biggest of all those bands, strangely enough.
What about the thrash scene specifically? I mean, you were pretty much there from the very beginning of thrash metal in LA. Tell me about how that got started.
So obviously Metallica was the first one that really started that whole thrash scene from here. You know, back then we didn't have the distinctions of thrash and glam and all. So it just kind of was the scene, scene. You know, basically from working at the record store, I found out there was this whole scene in LA that was going on that nobody knew or cared about, and kind of the influence of what was happening in England, the, you know, Metal from Others compilations and those things.
Right.
That's when I really decided, well, you know, I knew all the distributors, so I got the idea to put together a compilation album, called all of them up because I knew them from the record store and said, hey, if I put together a compilation of local LA heavy metal bands, would you guys put it out? And they said, sure. So as I'm putting this thing together, you know, Lars calls me up and he calls me and says, hey, if I put together a band, can I be on your compilation album? I said, sure. So I needed people on there anyway, so I said, sure, why not? But when he got to the studio, they had recorded it the night before on a Fostex cassette. When he got to the studio, we had it all on, you know, quarter-inch reel, so we had to bump it up to the reel.
Right.
And it was gonna be $50, and like I didn't have 50 bucks, Lars didn't have 50 bucks. Luckily, my friend John had 50 bucks, so he was able to pay the 50 bucks to get the tape bumped up, and it finally made it onto the record.
I mean, I don't want to pump Brian Slagle ego up too much, but I mean, if it wasn't for you, Metallica wouldn't have had, I guess, that may not have got started, or at least you gave them their first opportunity.
Sure. I just was trying to provide something so that these people outside of LA could see what cool bands we had here. So, right guy, right place, right time for something. I'm just happy that, you know, pretty much all the bands that were on all those early records did well. And that was the whole idea behind doing it, is just, you know, I'm a huge fan of this music. I want to turn it on to other people too.
Right. Anyway, 80s.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, the big shift that happens there, which is really cool, is that when you get that shift to the video, you're also getting the shift to America from the UK. That was just like a really sort of concentrated thing. A lot of those great records didn't even get released in America.
Yeah.
But with MTV, so MTV's 1981, but 1983, 1984, you get, you know, some of the biggest stars are ZZ Top, Motley Crue, Rat,
Right.
Dokken. Quiet Riot has an album in '83 that's 6 times platinum. So so in '83,
John's favorite band, Winger.
Yeah, Winger. Yeah, Winger eventually comes, but
Or was it Warrant? I forgot, but that's a side note.
But Great White as well, Twisted Sister's in there. So essentially, and that is the really corporatization, the growing up of the record industry there, because then you get into those crazy stories where people are saying we spent $300,000 on a video or whatever.
You also have this sort
I'm
of
not sure it all went into the video.
you have this kind of skepticism emerging too in the 80s, like almost simultaneously with the boom of metal. Like '84, you have This Is Spinal Tap comes out, which like obviously a very funny movie, but it's not exactly generous to the hard rock community. '86, you have Heavy Metal Parking Lot, Decline of Western Civilization, Volume 2. I mean, the sort of critique of this sort of decadence or the presumed stupidity of metal is almost happening simultaneously.
Well,
with
the other big critique of it is thrash itself.
Right.
I mean,
As a
Metallica
reaction
and
to hair
Exodus
metal.
and Slayer and all these guys just saying this stuff's ridiculous. We hate this stuff. So they came up with a more virulent form of it based on their love of all those new wave of British heavy metal bands. And just to mention a couple other things about 1980, like when we get into the years, but as well, you had Angel Witch's first album.
Oh, right, yeah.
Seminal album. Iron Maiden's first album.
Sure.
Motorhead, Ace of Spades, but again, Motorhead, you know, I love that idea about how really nothing grows from in rock all the way through. I mean, Rainbow Rising maybe a little bit, AC/DC, I remember we considered those the first albums that had no mellow songs on them, but right at the end you get Motorhead, Overkill and Bomber, which are completely heavy start.
We're really
finish,
getting in the weeds on the UK scene at this time, because you have to remember in the UK, the music climate shifts so quickly because it's such a densely populated country. Everyone's in the same time zone. Everyone's reading the same 4 magazines. It shifts very quickly. So you had this little moment of the early 70s metal birth, but then you had prog, and then you had punk. And then it, like there were like 2 genres that were massive in their own right before we sort of got back to heavy metal. Now, I'm not suggesting that those intervening bands weren't influenced by Deep Purple or Led Zeppelin in some way. I'm sure they were. Not to mention we have Slade and Sweet. We've got all these different sounds percolating at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like same with hardcore dying in like '84 in the US. I mean, by 1980, the big British punk boom had arguably already died out. I mean, you had The Clash signed to like CBS Records and stuff like that. I mean, I think any idea of the punk scene being an underground in the UK had already sort of dissipated by then. And I think maybe because of that, in the same way that, you know, you had certain people who were punk or hardcore fans become metal fans if they didn't become like straight edge Cro-Mags, Agnostic Front fans who were fighting the metal fans.
And then back to the UK thing, you get this weird thing where Iron Maiden is really an amalgam of both prog and punk,
especially the
in
Di'Anno era,
in a weird way. Although Steve Harris maintained with me on Metal Evolution that there was absolutely no punk influence on Iron Maiden, and I will continue and go to my grave insisting that there was. Even though you guys were doing something musically quite different than punk, do you think you were inspired by how the punk?
We were inspired by nothing. Anything to do with punk. We just didn't want have anything to do with it at all. We just hated everything about it. Absolutely everything.
So was it important to you that there was more of kind of a respect, like more of a brotherhood kind of dynamic?
There was no respect with the punks. It was just there was a brotherhood going on with and respect going on with the rock community. Right. Because I think everyone was feeling a bit hard done by because they weren't getting the gigs anymore because all the punk bands were getting the gigs, and anything that was remotely, like sort of more mainstream rock wasn't even looked at anymore, So it was really tough for bands at the time, and there were a lot of pubs and clubs around, but it was just nowhere to play because it was all locked out with all these Herberts diving about all over the place and spitting.
Sorry,
God
Steve.
forbid.
Can't let it go. Can't let it go, Steve. Anyway, okay, so the easy part is done. The most important metal decade, in our opinion, is the 80s. Now the hard part. What's the most important metal year of all time? Here we go. Let's go back to the viewers. Marcus Ferguson, 1975 has always struck me as a stellar year. Alice Cooper, Welcome to My Nightmare, Rush, Fly By Night, and Caress of Steel. Maybe more the former than the latter, especially if you ask the band. Anyway, Zeppelin, Physical Graffiti, Aerosmith, Toys in the Attic, AC/DC, TNT, Rainbow's debut. We haven't talked about Rainbow. Kiss, Queen, A Night at the Opera, Uriah Heep, Return to Fantasy. A lot of classics came out that year. So many great albums. It rubbed off on a lot of young ears. That struck the spark that launched 1,000 bands. Jamie Laszlo, never short on opinions. Jamie Laszlo. The best year for metal has to be 1980. Maiden's first album, Heaven and Hell, Back in Black, British Steel, Ace of Spades, Blizzard of Oz. That was a fucking good year.
That's a lot. That is a lot.
Okay. They are all bona fide classics. I mean, I don't have to mention the artist's name to each album because everyone already knows. David Walden. The answers are not one size fits all. They are individual and fluid. So here it goes for me. Best year, 83. For me, it started my lifelong love affair with Maiden, Peace of Mind. Love that record so much. It was also the gateway year to everything awesome that was coming out and getting darker, heavier, and faster. Adrian Bergrund. Adrian, how are you? Best year, 1984, far and away. The volume of seminal, epical, highly influential albums to come out that year remains unparalleled. Fabio BM, 1986. It's the best year for me. Several genre-defining masterpieces were released, such as Slayer, Fate's Warning, and Dark Angel, not to mention arguably the best Iron Maiden and Metallica albums.
Somewhere Back in Time?
Somewhere in Time.
The worst Iron Maiden lyric is he died of fever in Babylonia at the end of Alexander the Great.
Wow.
Brooke, no contest.
You really needed to get that out, didn't you?
I will take the lyrics to Future Real.
Do we need some time?
No, it's just...
Down, boy.
I disagree.
There's also the first King Diamond album.
Fatal
Great
Portrait.
ones from Megadeth and Creator. Yes, finally, Creator's in the conversation. And this is just 1 year of the most productive decade by far. Peter van der Waal. What's the best year? I would agree on 86. Master of Puppets, Rain and Blood. The most named metal albums, to ask every metalhead worldwide. They were both released in the same year. Eric Douglas. Best year, 89. Sepultura, Beneath the Remains, Obituary, Slowly We Rot, Repulsion, Horrified, Morbid Angel, Altars of Madness, Terrorizer, World Downfall, Carcass, Symphonies of Sickness, and Napalm Death, Mentally Murdered. That's a really disturbing year.
Also,
I loved it.
Faith No More, The Real Thing, broke the Billboard Top 10 in 89, or maybe it came out in 89 and broke it in 90.
Or like 91. It was like way later. Good point. Azael Garza, best year, I'm biased. 2004. Because of the resurgence of metal for the next generation via the convergence of the new wave of American heavy metal, Slipknot, Lamb of God, Shadows Fall, Mastodon, seminal releases from their multiple European influences, In Flames, Dark Tranquility, Immortal Arch Enemy, Amon Amarth, Cradle of Filth, The Haunted. Yeah, remember, there's just more bands too. Anyway, the general diversity of metal music at the time, from Converge to Nightwish to Clutch to High on Fire to Opeth, and a rekindled platform on Headbangers Ball, and the internet at large, making metal more popular, available, and influential to the masses. This momentum has carried metal into the current era. Whoa, that's a lot. Martin, what do you want to pick up on? You don't need to tell us your favorite year, but what does that all bring to mind? I mean, does it sway your opinions? Does it illuminate some new ideas?
It's a lot of variety there, and my two that I'm conflicted over are in there. I'll tell you what they are. I mean,
they were all 80s except for one.
2004.
Yeah.
Panopticon by ISIS, great record.
And there's a 75 in there as well. I mean,
we never went to the same shows.
No.
My third would be a tie between 1970 and 1986.
Okay.
My close
Or
tie.
1980, you mean?
No, 1970 and 1986 would be my third and fourth. My first and second, and I don't know which is which, would be 1980 or 1983. And
can you make a case for 83 over 84? Because if I'm thinking of a year that's not 86,
I love this show.
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why.
I want July to December.
Yeah. No, 83 to me, again, getting back to that difference between heavy metal and metal. I think metal is invented in 1983 with Kill 'Em All. Right. And I think essentially...
Did he just say that?
Metal itself, not heavy metal.
Okay,
metal,
all right.
Kill 'Em All was, I remember dropping the needle on that for the first time, and the big difference was, you know, it was literally a leaching or a concentration of anything from the new wave of British heavy. It was way heavier than anything from the new wave of British heavy metal. But also that year, you have Iron Maiden Peace of Mind, which a lot of people consider is the best Iron Maiden album. But I really think an important part of this whole thing is where did metal get huge? And again, it's the Rat EP, the Great White EP, the second Twisted Sister album. You know, they're starting to grow. Quiet Riot at that time. You've got Dio, Holy Diver. You know, Black Sabbath's gone down a little bit. You've got Ozzy, Bark at the Moon. Yeah. So you also get, I think, some of the very best of the tail end of the new wave of British heavy metal. You get Fastway, great album. Saxon's, my favorite Saxon album, Power and the Glory. You get, I think Tank had an album in there. Raven, my favorite Raven album, All for One is right in there. Witchfinder General is in there. Yeah. Not sure. Are they there yet?
82?
Trouble is 84. Trouble is 84. But you do get Witchfinder General. So yeah, it's funny, because when you start breaking up these thrash milestones of the early days, 1986, the conversation ends pretty fast after Master and after Rain and Blood. Anthrax kind of drops on the odd years. They drop in 84, they drop in 87, 89. So there's problems putting Anthrax in there. Exodus is a bit of a problem with 85. Megadeth comes late in 85. So really, I think. And the other thing I want to say about, you know, when we fall on 86 because of Master, is Master really more important than Kill 'Em All? I think Kill 'Em All is more.
I thought your favorite Metallica record was Ride the Lightning.
It's Ride the Lightning.
That's what I would pick too, which is why 84 to me is.
But
you guys are so much cooler than me.
I can't make enough of a case for 84 over 83, because I think basically the floodgates break in 83. That is the year that they turn out the lights in the UK and they turn them on the Sunset Strip for all metal. You know, Metal Blade, it's all metal with Metal Blade. I mean, it's the poverty metal, the early power metal. It's a little bit of hair metal on those early samplers. Brian and Lars are basically co-inventing thrash, and at the same time hair metal. You get huge
Armored
albums
Saint,
coming out of all that.
You get all of that. Okay,
so there you go.
I want to hear what I'm surprised by the comment again was that they're all 80s except for one. Like, there's some serious blind spots here in the 90s, or is it simply a matter of, like, there's a bit of chance, luck that happens here? I mean, to your point about the 80s, like, you know, you got 12 months, and it just so happens that enough albums land within that 12-month period.
It's way less than the 90s too.
But my point in that is you know, the 2004 comment kind of made me think about, you know, there's just way more bands, and there's way more metal styles, obviously. So you've got this massive proliferation. But I think we're all a bit sort of pulled back a little bit to the earlier years, because these are these giant metal albums that came out in the early 80s, whether it's 80, 83, 86, that we just, you know, these blind spots develop.
I will say of the 2000s too, I will admit that it's a bit of a blind spot in the sense that that's when I was like really getting into this music and coming of age on the internet and stuff like that. I wasn't held to whatever the release schedule was for the year, right? I could go on Napster and download all these old albums and stuff like that. So, I mean, 2004, there's a couple good albums I can think of at the top of my head, like that ISIS album I mentioned.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, but I mean, the 80s thing I think we're stuck on. I mean, 86, there's also Rain and Blood, right? Like, that's such a huge album. It's not just, we're not just making the case out the back of Master of Puppets. Locally here, I think that's when Soldiers of Misfortune by Sacrifice came out, was 86.
I think it was a little bit later. Anyway, if it was live, I could get help on this.
Second Megadeth album.
Yeah, and 80, I mean, we talk, okay, obviously Iron Maiden's such a huge band. I think we're all fans of Iron Maiden. But like saying 1980 because the first Maiden album came out, it's not enough for me. Like Power Slave is 84, I believe, or like Peace of Mind in 83. I think if you want to talk about like when the Maiden sound came to life, it's those records. It's not, I mean, I love that first Paul Di'Anno album, don't get me wrong. But that's not an album you would hand to someone to say, this is what Iron Maiden sounds like.
Fair enough.
So yeah, again, we get into this thing, it's like, when did something form, when did it begin, and when did it really hit its stride?
I need your help here. Is there, I just for discussion purposes, is there a year in the 90s which stands out to any of you guys?
Well, I made the case for 92, so I'll shut up about it.
And refresh me, like why 92?
Well, because I just love that industrial metal stuff.
Yeah.
I think that there was, again, a simultaneous mainstreaming of what you would call alt metal. You had stuff even coming out of 1990, like you had Alice in Chains touring with Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, kind of building this bridge between metal and then what would be called grunge in time. And then if you're a fan of the second wave of black metal, the true Norwegian black metal scene, I mean, that's when all those records came out, was kind of 92 to 94.
Yeah.
Even Emperor, where, you know, their best record I think came out in 94, their first AP came out in 92.
Yeah.
So whether you're watching it on MTV, which again, MTV, huge influence. I mean, for such a visual music and culture, it's a huge influence. But whether you're sick of that and you want to go listen to the Burzums and people who are recording deliberately shitty sounding albums and stuff like that, it was just super fertile. I mean, that's the 90s period
for you.
I love that idea, but like 1992 is interesting. I wanted to mention 94 again a little bit because of how much black metal and stuff came out then, and Pantera Far Beyond Driven. But I love this 1992 idea because what you also get in 92 is you get bands from the 80s and the 70s trying really, really hard. This is what I call the try really, really hard years, where, you know, if you were a corporate hair metal band, you would go to Vancouver and record with Bruce Fairbairn or whatever. But what happens is, when you have Nirvana happen and Pearl Jam happen, and these records are, you know, well on their way to Diamond and grunge is taking over, every other band like gets really introspective and says, our ass has just gotten kicked, we have to try really, really hard. So a lot of my favorite hair metal albums are 1992 albums. Kiss makes Revenge around that time. Motley Crue gets better.
Painkiller?
Painkiller is
really
1990.
Okay, right.
But, you know, Mr. Big and Cinderella, even Poison, all these bands kind of improve in the early 90s. Badlands, Love, Hate, like two of my favorite bands from that whole thing there. Guns N' Roses with Use Your Illusion is 91, I believe, right? So I love this, you know, I think everybody just tries way harder soon as grunge kicks them all to the curb, and that's 91.
I also think 92, speaking of Guns N' Roses, I mean, you have the Guns N' Roses, Metallica, Faith No More, that legendary tour, which A, what a lineup, but B, it also sort of suggests these kind of cracks forming in metal at this huge level. You have all these concerts turning into riots, you have the egos emerging, you have these people being kind of superstars in a way that might have alienated a lot of people. So again, there's interesting stuff going on in the mainstream, interesting stuff going on in the underground. It's sort of a something for everyone period. Psalm 69 by Ministry, I think, is one of the great albums. Although 86 is when Ministry went, Twitch came out, I believe, and they went from being a sort of new wave, new romantic band to being like, no, we're going to do this kind of heavier industrial sound, like one of the early proper industrial albums, which just brings me back to 86.
I wonder if bands are still on the ends of their contracts too. There's still money around in 92. Like the, you know, the Titanic hasn't completely sunk yet. There's still,
you sign a 5-record deal in 89.
Yeah, you're still kind of in the business at that point, and it hasn't completely collapsed. People aren't really dire about the state of heavy metal probably until 94, 95.
All right, well, yeah, no shortage of opinions, as usual, on Lock Horns Redux. Thanks for all those thoughts. I mean, it's kind of messy. Sometimes it seems clear for a moment, and then it gets messy again. But I think we've reached the point where we need to decide what we think is the most important metal year of all time, here being 2020, where we celebrate the 50th anniversary of this music. Okay.
And nobody can debate it after we've decided.
It's
don't comment.
The book will be forever closed on the topic. Absolutely, that's why we're here. So Martin, we went with you for the decades. So John, we're gonna go with you for the year. What's the most important metal year in your opinion?
Okay, I'm gonna make another big swing here. I'm gonna say 1984. I think 86 is an amazing pick, but I can fancy myself a bit of a contrarian, right?
Yep.
So the 84, you have Ride the Lightning, my favorite Metallica album. You have Bathory's debut. You have Don't Break the Oath by Merciful Fate. You have, I think, the first Celtic Frost EP came out in 84.
I was looking at Celtic Frost. You're right.
Morbid Tales.
Morbid Tales is 84.
So you kind of have this sort of like weird proto black metal thing going on, while thrash is like really ascendant. I don't know. And again, you have This Is Spinal Tap in theaters. I mean,
what more could you ask for?
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, yeah. I think with '86 you have undeniably a great year for thrash, and of course the Maiden album '84. You know, but I think '84. There's just like, it's moving in a few different directions at the same time, and that to me, what makes for a good year is a fertile year for different tastes, not just the best Wobble albums or the best thrash albums or something like that.
Shocked that ISIS and Ministry did not factor in any of that, but that's okay.
I think this is when Ministry maybe had their sort of soft Depeche Mode aping album out.
84 for John Semley, Martin Popoff. What year is it for you?
Well, again, I'm conflicted between 2 years, and the 2 years I'm conflicted between is 80 and 83. But I think I am going to stick with 1983 because I like the complexity of it being the year that metal is invented with Metallica Kill 'Em All. And I will raise you a Don't Break the Oath with a Melissa from 1983. So,
but
no.
didn't Fatal Portrait also come out in '84? Or was that '86?
No, 86.
Right,
86
okay,
for that, yeah. So, but, and also, some really big albums like Bark at the Moon. You get Dio coming in with Holy Diver, but you also have, I think, this fine music. I mean, it's hair metal, but it's proto hair metal, shall we say, with the likes of Dokken, Great White, Quiet Riot, Rat especially, and that is where America, finally takes over. For a long, long time. I mean, there's just this great run that they have there. It's the MTV age for real, again, with all those Motley Crue videos and ZZ Top and Rat eventually, not Rat in '83 for videos so much, more like '84. But I just think there's a lot happening in that year. And again, it's maybe the tail end, the last year of the New Wave of British Heavy Metal. So we get to give them a little bit of props as well. And some of my favorite New Wave of British Heavy Metal albums do come out in that year, although it's more seminal. 1980 is more seminal for the New Wave.
Peace of Mind, Iron Maiden, right?
Yes, exactly. Peace
Did
of
you
Mind,
mention
Iron
Kill 'Em
Maiden.
All? Probably the most obvious one of them
Kill 'Em All for sure is the big one. So yeah, it's funny. I mean, thrash is a big deal in all this, and thrash more or less gets spread between 83, 84, 85, 86. Really, that takes care of most of the big seminal albums. But I think first is super important, and this is where you get the first big one, and i.e., again, the invention of metal instead of heavy metal. You might say heavy metal becomes invented in 1980, but metal, which is the modern version of everything we're talking about here that goes on for decades and decades after 1983, that gets invented in 1983.
This is tough.
It's on you, man.
This is tough. Okay, so I mean, just start with coming in, it was 86 for me. And I think that's because that's my heart.
But if you were to rule that, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Also the year of my birth.
It's a short conversation, 86,
How did this become about John?
Doesn't go very deep.
This is the thing. I think that I came storming in here going, it's Master of Puppets, it's Rain and Blood. You cannot find two more important records for the last 3 decades of metal than those two albums. Yes, there are others, but these are, within the span of 12 months, you get two undisputed giants in the history of metal that literally, and perhaps I was 12 in '86. Yeah, thanks, young guy. I was there, and what was at the record shop, I pulled those records. I mean, they changed my life. So personally, I came in here '86, but I gotta say, listening to you guys, listening to some of the comments has made me really rethink it, because you're right. I think 86, 2 albums does not a year make. Maybe there's an expression there. And I'm torn. I'm torn between 80 and I'm torn between 89. 89 with Beneath the Remains and Altars of Madness and so many other seminal death metal underground records, Symphonies of Sickness. These records have actually, who would have thought at the time, these records have become so influential to bands even starting today. More influential, probably, than Maiden's first album or, Ozzy's first solo album. However, I think I was really swayed by Jamie Laszlo's argument about 1980 because, and maybe it's because it's fertile, to your point, We get so many albums in that year that represent either the starting point for some huge acts or really the peak moment for many of those acts. Obviously with Maiden, with Blizzard of Oz, with Back in Black, with Ace of Spades. I hadn't really thought about it. And then as we've talked, I think I've been swayed. I think it represents a real gateway year in heavy metal. It's both emergent and also like hugely popular. It's on the front end of the birth of heavy metal culture that we've spent time talking about today. It's on the front end of the most important decade in heavy metal that we've also been talking about. It's hard for me to look at that list of those 5 or 6 albums and say there's a better year. And that's tough for me because my listening habits, and I think in terms of like what's going on in metal today in terms of influence and musicians that are coming up and creating the music for the first time, it's not the most important year. But I think if you look historically over the full 5 decades, it's hard to beat 1980.
What if I were to remind you, Bathory's debut album, 1984.
You already mentioned that earlier.
Oh, really?
It did not sway me, but thanks.
What I forgot is Slayer's first album in 1983.
Shit.
Okay. Well, here's the thing I like about 1980 is symbolically it's clean, it's neat. You know, it sort of encompasses the whole decade.
You guys are cut off.
80. Okay, fine. 1980.
I'm good with 80.
Do we all
You're good with 80?
Sign in blood?
I was very close to 80.
Yeah, I mean, I can't deny that.
I mean, yeah, it perhaps like I don't listen to albums from 1980 on a regular basis. You know, if I had a, this is tricky. As a fan, I think there would be a different desert island year, probably. Might be 83, might be 89, might be 86. But I think historically, looking at the way that the music has evolved and looking at through that lens of seminal years, it's 1980.
I can get in with that.
Okay.
Can we still?
I'm good with that.
Are we still friends?
We're still friends.
At least we're in the same decade.
You can't argue against it. It's not like 83, 84, 85 where you're splitting hairs, you know?
Yeah.
That's my mantra, man. You know, it might not be the best idea, but you can't argue against
You're a
it.
unifier.
That's what I try to, you know, trying to bring people together.
Absolutely. Perfect.
Thanks for doing this, guys.
Okay.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah.
Not too much blood on the floor. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Yeah, subscribe to BangerTV. Help us to continue to build the biggest online metal show, channel, whatever we want to call it. Whatever it is, we like it. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Lock Horns Redux.
Yeah!